Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Rickets, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Ellen Weber, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Ellen is here today to discuss rules of thumb, 52 principles for winning at business without losing yourself. This is my advanced copy that I got a while ago, lucky me, and I've bent so many pages of so many rules in this book. It's fascinating. This book is a much-needed guide for individuals in every walk of life who want to make sense out of these confusing, challenging, and compelling times. Drawing from his own experiences in a wide range of interactions with some of the world's leading thinkers and highest achievers, Weber has produced a collection of rules that come from real-life lessons learned. Alan Weber writes a regular column for USA Today and was the co-founder and former editor of Fast Company magazine. Before founding Fast Company, Alan was the managing editor of the Harvard Business Review, two very, very different environments, and has written numerous articles for national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Please join me in welcoming Alan Weber to Microsoft Research to discuss rules of thumb, 52 principles for winning at business without losing yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. Kim, that was so formal. She bragged to me that she was the free spirit who was
They wrote that for me.
unmanageable and unbought and unbossed, and then she reads something from a script. Well, it's great to be here. I certainly appreciate all of you sitting far away from me because I do have a projectile vomiting problem, and so to have you far, far from the front rows is a very sound judgment on your part. It is great fun for me to come here. I used to come to Microsoft in the old days when I was the editor of Fast Company, but my agenda then was to sell advertising pages. And so I would come out here and try to harass people to buy a page in Fast Company, and we had great times. And Microsoft, I'm happy to say, was a huge supporter of Fast Company, and we had a great and productive relationship. I am no longer there. Microsoft is, so it's still working. What I thought I would do today with the amount of time we have together is try to edit myself so I don't talk too long and leave time for a dialogue. Editors are notoriously bad at editing themselves. We're good at cutting everybody else. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this book, the book project, how it came to be, how I think the book helps people. If we have time, get you to do a little demonstration project with me, do a little beta. I have prizes for people who ask good questions. So we come with, to borrow from Chris Anderson, we come with free stuff. Free is good. We have books for sale in the back of the room. I advise you to buy 2 per person. If you buy 1, it's a book. If you buy 2, it's a collection. And you really ought to be collectors at this point in your lives. So that's the preamble. What is this thing about, this book project? Let me tell you a couple of stories and then a couple of the rules. Story number 1 is back in the 1980s. I was working at the Harvard Business Review, and a visionary fellow named Ted Levitt, who some of you may have heard of, became the faculty editor of HBR. Ted is he's no longer alive, but he was the guru of marketing for decades. He's the fellow who I think is largely credited with inventing the concept of global marketing. And his best-selling HBR article of all time was called Marketing Myopia, which I borrowed and turned into one of my rules. Ted was the faculty editor, and I watched how he worked. And one of the things he did as a practice was to carry 3x5 cards in his shirt pocket. Now that thing you're looking at is an enlarged version of a 3x5 card, but he would walk around with these things, and you can think of this as low tech, but it's really good stuff, this paper and pen thing. And in the course of a day, he would talk to dozens of people. He had a phenomenal Rolodex of friends and intellectual colleagues, not just at the business school, but in New York and around the world. And he would randomly pick up the phone and call somebody, or he would make it a point to book a lunch with somebody on the faculty. And when somebody said something that really crystallized an idea, Ted would reach in and take out a 3x5 card and write down the core of the idea and stick it in a coat pocket. And at the end of the day, I would go in to see him, and he would have a collection of 3x5 cards from the course of conversations throughout the day, and he would be putting them into different file folders. This one is an article he would write. This is an article he would get somebody else to write. This is an idea for a book or a course. This is an idea for an ad campaign that he would talk to Saatchi & Saatchi or one of the other ad agencies about. And the 3x5 card was his idea capture technique. So I began to emulate Ted. I thought it was a really smart way to get ideas and collect them. And over the course of the last 20, 25 years, I've been doing that, and I still have a batch with me. I was on an airplane flying out here from Washington, D.C. last night. The woman across the aisle from me was talking to her husband and instructing him to remember to take out the garbage. That was not an idea that I wrote down. But I then asked her, well, you know, why do you have to tell your husband to take out the garbage? And she said, well, you can tell him what you want him to do, but you can't tell him too early. Now, I thought that was a brilliant management piece of advice. You know, it's just-in-time instructions for husbands. She said, he doesn't have to eat his vegetables, but the baby does. Another great rule of thumb, right, when you're dealing with people you're trying to manage. She said her final rule of thumb, sitting across the aisle on this airplane while we waited to take off, nobody reads the condo rules, just put out the trash. A great lesson for organizational life for everybody. So I still carry these. I still write things down. I take notes from people who say interesting things, places they've been, interesting companies they've visited. It is, for me, low tech, but really high tactile, high touch, and I still use it. So that's part one of why there's a book called Rules of Thumb. Part two is a little more serious. I was out talking to a company about a year and a half ago, one of the large privately held corporations in America, and it was the CEO and his top 50 executive reports. And I gave a speech about leadership and change and organizational transformation, dealing with a time of great turbulence. This is before we suffered a global financial meltdown, but there was a lot of stuff already going on. And at the end of my speech, the CEO looked around to his executive group and he said, Mr. Weber has raised some interesting questions about leadership and what leaders do and how people follow leaders. I'd like us to take a minute and think about who in America today has moral authority. Think about business leaders, think about political leaders, religious or spiritual leaders, somebody in the not-for-profit sector who you think has moral authority, who when they speak, you really vest your confidence, your faith in their view of how the world works. There was about a 5-minute silence in the room. And I could see people's minds churning. Some of you are doing it now. As you think through, all right, is there a political leader? Is there a religious leader? Is there a CEO or a business leader? Is there somebody in the nonprofit world who, when they speak, I really think they've got the right take on how to play the game? 5 minutes of dead silence in this room of corporate executives. And I went home at the end of that talk, and by the way, nobody ever came up with a single name. There was no nominee. I went home and I had a kind of a personal epiphany. And my personal epiphany was, in this day and age of social networking and grassroots movements, if we're going to come up with a new handbook for how to play the game, or even what the game is, we're going to have to do it ourselves. There is nobody else who's going to write it for us. And I went back through my collection of 3x5 cards and speeches and articles I'd written over the last 25, 30 years, starting with working in Portland, Oregon in the mayor's office, going back to Washington, D.C., working in the Department of Transportation, Harvard Business Review, Fast Company. Since I left Fast Company, I've been traveling and working in nonprofit boards and moderating programs for businesses around the world. I started peeling through these cards looking for advice and counsel that I could use to kickstart a conversation about how we're going to do this differently going forward. I didn't predict a worldwide financial crisis, but I think in some ways I did see a set of changes that were going on that really represent what Andy Grove in the old days of Wintel used to call a global strategic inflection point. And I saw it first. I saw one of these back in 1989 when I was in Japan. It really led to the founding of Fast Company. I got a fellowship back in '89 to go to Japan for 3 months. And I had a business card. On one side said Harvard Business Review. On the other side it said Japan Society of New York. And with that, I opened doors across Japan to leaders in business, in politics, in technology. And when I came back, I had 4 thoughts in '89 about how the world was changing. The first was that technology was going to change how we all worked. Now, it's hard to think back to 1989 probably because you live in the future. But 20 years ago, when I walked through the labs of the major Japanese companies, the digital future was still in the lab. Everything was just beginning to come out. And the world was beginning to become personal, portable, and digital. And when I saw that in Japan, I came back to the US and said, I don't know a lot about technology. I'm not a techie, but I know that how we all work will change. The second thing I saw in Japan was globalization. That the world of competition in business, in communication, in financial flows, in idea flows, was changing from one defined by national borders to one where those borders were being erased, made less and less relevant. And in the process, when you combine it with technology, the boundaries and borders between companies and organizations, within organizations, how work moved, how ideas flowed, globalization, technology, together, we're going to erase our then known map of the world and of the workplace. The third thing that was happening was a generational shift. Back in '89, Bill Clinton, in political terms, was just coming onto our national stage. George Bush Sr. was walking off. It was kind of a representational moment where the World War II generation was being displaced by the baby boom generation in terms of leadership in business, in government, and around the world. And the third shift was a diversity shift. That when I looked in '89 at the magazine world that I was a part of, business magazines, if you picked them up back then, Fortune, Forbes, Business Week, and you looked just at the pictures, you thought you lived in a world of white men facing right. And in magazine terms, if you look at newsstand sales today, most business magazines will still take a picture of a white man facing right, and the headline will be something about, what a tough, bold person he is, because that is the image of corporate strength circa 1989. But in Japan, there weren't a lot of white men facing right. And when I got back to the United States, I noticed that for the first time in U.S. history, the enrollment in law school, business school, other professions of women, for the first time was more than 50% of the enrollees, and that the world was going to change profoundly, and that we were going to be facing a workplace of diversity, not of white men facing right. That was '89, and that gave birth to Fast Company. Now, I look at what's happening 20 years later, and I would take every single one of those 4 forces, and I would spin them forward in a multiple of 10. that technology is now, we take it for granted, and yet it is constantly changing and altering and amping how we work. And Web 2.0 or 3.0 or wherever we are in the evolution of the web is still a massive game changer. It's not just changing space and time, it's changing who's in charge and how we talk to each other. It is inclusive and participatory, and it makes the web three-dimensional rather than just two-dimensional. Technology, the change in globalization. We all now know that BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, is the force for changing the future. The United States is by no means out of the picture, and we get a lot of head shaking, as we did in '89 when Japan was dominant in the financial markets. But the game of globalization is so far advanced from where it was in '89. Again, it is like globalization 2.0. Generational change, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, a president who is a 40-something, and now we talk about a post-baby boom political system, total game changer. And then diversity. I was with Dan Pink in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago. Probably most of you have read his Whole New Mind. Dan pointed out that we have not had a white male Secretary of State since Warren Christopher held the job under Bill Clinton. It's been people of color or women for the last, 15, 16 years. The game of diversity is something that we now take for granted. It's not even an issue. So I think there is another global strategic inflection point 20 years after the one that spawned Fast Company, and in some ways, I'm the same guy. I'm doing the same thing. It's a book, not a magazine. So that's the derivation of the book. I would like to try to do a quick little exercise if you're game for it. One of the rules that I think is really relevant to people in the world of business right now and the world of work, particularly with so much change going on, is a rule where I focus on two questions. And it's very, very good for people who are into 3x5 cards. What I would propose you take 1 minute to do to humor me is take out the 3x5 card that I think you were given. If you didn't get one, we got plenty of them. We can throw them out to people. You want to be the audience participation guru? This is rule number 23. And rule number 23 says, who needs one? I got a spare. Rule number 23 is very simple. It says, keep two lists. One list is what gets you up in the morning. So take a minute and look at your 3x5 card, and on the back of it, write down, got one? You're good? What gets you up in the morning? Now, the sad truth is that in the United States today, something like 80% of Americans hate their jobs. What gets them up in the morning is the idea that they have to get up. They have to get up and they have to go to the workplace, because if they don't do that, they won't be able to pay the rent, or they won't be able to put food on the table, or they won't be able to pay their car payments. And I personally think that's a pretty sad story. I think if you buy the idea that we're at this amazing moment of global strategic inflection, there's a lot of reasons to get up in the morning. There's a lot of things to do in the workplace that would be a challenge, that would be exciting. But rarely do we stop to think about it that way. We either think about the mental list of the to-do list of what I have to get done, but we don't stop and think about why I'm doing it in the first place. And when you do stop and think about your own reason for getting up in the morning, it raises a lot of questions about why you're doing it in the first place. Why this job? Why now? Why here? Why am I really committed and excited about what I'm doing? And if the answer is I'm not, well, that raises a whole other set of questions. If the answer is I am, but I really haven't stopped to think about why, then at least you can analyze it and put more into it and get more out of it. So first thought, best thought, what gets you up in the morning? Then turn the card over and write on the back your answer to a different question, and that is, what keeps you up at night? Now here again, something like 50+% of Americans can't sleep without a sleeping pill. I don't think that's because they've got stuff on their mind that they're excited about. I think it's probably because they can't face getting up in the morning because the answer on the other side of the card is so dissatisfying to them. But I do know that when I ran Fast Company and we'd do an interview with a CEO or an executive, we would always start the interview with this question: what keeps you up at night? Not what's the greatest thing about your company or what's your new product or your new service, which is what they always wanted to talk about. I wanted to know what keeps you up at night. What's that nagging voice in your head, the thing you really care about, whether it's in your community or in your family or in your school district? What is it that keeps you up at night that if you had more time and more energy and more psychic space, you would actually like to pay some attention to? But the only time you get to work on it or think about it is at night when it's quiet, and maybe before you go to bed, you're thinking about something you read that really troubles you. It could be about the environment. It could be about the growing disparity between the haves and the have-nots. It could be about the plight of women who are abused by their spouses. Anything that keeps you up at night is worth writing down on the back of that card. And the thought that I have from my own experience is, and from interviewing people in business, is that's the stuff that they really care about. But it's not allowed on the job. You're supposed to check that stuff at the door. But I've found in organizations and companies of all kinds where you're allowed to put those two pieces together, when you're allowed to integrate what gets you up in the morning with what keeps you up at night, you find organizations that are alive, where the people are alive and the commitment, the energy is palpable when you walk in the door in the morning and when you go home at the end of the day at night. So I leave that with you as just a little beta exercise of what I think this book is designed to do, and that is to stimulate conversations among each other, but also to provoke a conversation with yourself about what do you really care about, why are you doing what you're doing, what kind of satisfaction do you get out of the work you're doing. Most of us in 2009 in the United States work very long hours. We get in early and we stay late, and we take our work home with us, and we're on 24/7 or close to it with all the technology that keeps us plugged in. And if you do the math of the number of hours you're working per day, the number of days you're working per week, the number of weeks you're working per month, and the number of months you're working per year, and the number of years you're going to be working, that's a lot. That's a large number. And if you can't answer the question, what gets me up in the morning and what keeps me up at night, to your own satisfaction, that's a big number of wasted hours. And I think in 2009, in a knowledge economy, those are the questions that knowledge workers ought to be wrestling with before they get up in the morning and before they go to bed at night. Let me give you one other rule and ask you to think about it, and then close with one other anecdote from the book. There's another rule that I learned in my work as an entrepreneur, starting Fast Company, and then in evaluating business plans and talking to young people who are running projects or who are trying to start their own businesses. Frequently I get offered the opportunity to read people's business plans for magazines, publications, things like that. And what I see over and over again is that people design their projects backwards. They design their projects from the front to the back instead of from the back to the front. And so rule number 3 is ask the last question first. And the last question, usually in business plan writing, is what's the point of the exercise? What's our definition of victory? What I've seen over and over again is people will get excited by an idea. They'll get turned on by the need to figure out how to execute it. They'll plan the team they need to build to make it happen, the financing they need to line up to be able to execute it. And then they get to the end and they say, oh yeah, and what's my definition of victory? What's my exit strategy? And by then, it's too late to have asked the question because they've already built this huge apparatus to do the project. And so they kind of cheat on asking and answering the last question. In the case of rule number 3, I learned this rule from a guy named Mark Fuller, who was the founder of Monitor, the consulting firm. And when we put out our beta issue of Fast Company in 1993, I went to Mark and had him write a piece for us called Business as War. Because Mark was a great strategic thinker who analyzed lessons from war making as strategic lessons for business. And he noted in his article that in the Vietnam War, the United States won every battle and lost the war. And the reason, he argued, that we lost the war was that we had no definition of victory. We didn't understand the point of the exercise going in, and as a consequence, we had no way of winning. And I think that equally applies to entrepreneurs, to business, to projects of all kinds. If you don't ask the last question first, how do you know why you're doing this project in the first place? How do you know how many resources will be required? What kind of commitment? What your definition of victory is so you know when to stop? If you don't ask the last question first, I believe almost every startup project is a fool's errand, where you can succeed and fail because you haven't really thought it through from the back end to the front. So I think it applies to work. I think it equally applies to each of our lives, which is why the subtitle of the book is 52 Truths for Winning at Business Without Losing Yourself. My analysis of the financial meltdown, it's really interesting what's going on. The economics profession is busily analyzing how economics got things wrong, leading to the Wall Street meltdown. And if you haven't read Robert Shiller's new book on animal spirits, I highly recommend it. You'll probably get him here. He was just here. I mean, it's a really good analysis of the human side of economics. What's really troubling is that the management profession isn't engaging in the same conversation. What's wrong with our management thinking that every 10 years or so, or even less than 10 years, a higher frequency than that, we suffer a huge system failure, whether it's Mike Milken and junk bonds, or the long-term credit fiasco, or the meltdown of Enron, or the meltdown of the dot-coms. The list goes on. And it happens more often than every 10 years. Now, what's wrong with this picture? If this were a family, and somebody in your family was having a nervous breakdown every 6 years, you'd have an intervention. You'd sit down with them and you'd say, there's this place called Betty Ford, and I really think you should go to it and rethink your life. You know, we need a 12-step program for managers because there's something fundamentally flawed with the way we're running our companies. And I believe what's fundamentally flawed is we're not asking the last question first. We're not saying, what's the point of the exercise? Now, the default setting for answering that question, as you all know, is money. Money is the easiest way to keep score in the United States of America. But it's not the way people keep score in other parts of the world, and it's certainly not a way that leads to work-life satisfaction, to a sense of accomplishment, to a sense of personal fulfillment. Every study I've ever seen of people in organizations says if you ask them what they care about in their workplace, money comes in number 5 or number 6. The first is I want to do work that matters. I want to have responsibility. I want to work with smart and interesting people. I want to continue to learn and develop my skills. I want to be valued. And then I want to be well compensated. And yet we rig the management system so that money is the default mechanism for what matters in the world of business. And then we wonder why organizations are structured to produce financial results that are unsustainable or unethical or illegal. And the answer is you get what you design your system to produce. So I think this challenge of defining the point of the exercise goes to something as systemic as business at large, but it's also as individual as how each of us keeps score in our own work and our own lives. Now let me offer you one last anecdote and one other sales point for my 3x5 card system. And it's rule number 52. It's the last rule I wrote. Rule number 52 says, stay alert, there are teachers everywhere. Stay alert, there are teachers everywhere. Now, we heard about the attention economy. I think the people who talk about the attention economy and who have written about the attention economy have it backwards. The typical sales pitch on the attention economy is, we live in a world of sensory overload, so many messages, so little content. The real value is finding a way to capture the attention of the market. I think that's completely backwards. I think the way you really create value is not by capturing other people's attention, but by paying attention to other people. And the rule that says, stay alert, there are teachers everywhere, and the real point of this 3x5 card trick, and it is a trick, it's a kind of a cheap trick, the real point of it is to get each of us to pay attention to what we're doing and to who we're with and what other people around us are saying, because there are teachers everywhere. And I'll give you a short example. About 6 months ago, I was on a plane flying from Frankfurt to Vienna. And I was sitting next to a guy who was dressed in an outlandish German hunting outfit, green tweed. He had a Japanese designer cap on and an orange ascot wound around his neck. And under normal circumstances, I would have put a do not disturb sign on my chest and had this guy at arm's length. But I knew a little bit about him. I knew that he ran the most interesting corporate events company in Europe. I knew that he'd grown up in southern Germany, one of 8 children. And I knew that when he was about 18 years old, he'd seen the movie Gandhi, and he'd gone off to India with his mother's blessing to seek his destiny. And he did what wanderers do when they go to India. He got sick, and he got a guru, and, did all that stuff, went barefoot, came back, and started his company to put on corporate events that is now, he has the largest practice in Europe. Daimler and BASF and you name it hires him because his programming is so theatrical and so brilliant. But he didn't forget what he learned in India. And he had this sense of social entrepreneurship. So he bought a coffee farm in India. And you Seattleites can appreciate a coffee farm. He thought it was a great thing to do, and he would pay above market prices to the farmer to grow the coffee beans, and that would be his social entrepreneurial venture. So I asked him how it was going. He said, well, I love to go down there because the man who operates this farm is so interesting and the environment is so lush. And he said, something really interesting happened to me when I was there last time. He said, I was sitting with the farmer and we were talking, and I noticed up in the tree there were monkeys eating the coffee beans and picking them off the coffee trees and eating all the beans. And he said, I got really upset because that's this man's cash crop. and the monkeys were decimating his cash crop. So I went to the guy and I said to the farmer, the monkeys are eating your coffee. Should I get a gun and shoot the monkeys? And the coffee farmer looked at him and gave him a wise look and said, you know, if you start shooting monkeys, you'll spend the rest of your life shooting monkeys. So when this guy told me this story, I whipped out my 3x5 card and I wrote down, if you start shooting monkeys, you'll spend the rest of your life shooting monkeys. Because how many of us see something in our field of view that is an annoyance and a small thing, but it's like a rock in your shoe. It drives you crazy, and all you can focus on is the monkeys eating the coffee beans. And if you start shooting those monkeys, you will spend the rest of your life shooting monkeys. Now, that's a completely episodic conversation with a guy on an airplane who I would normally not be at home for, but I was paying attention to him. I was listening into our conversation. And I came away from that with what I thought was a pretty good piece of advice that I've not only put into the book, but I use it with my kids. I use it in my own work life, evaluating whether something is really important or not. I look at the way President Obama picks his fights, and I think, good move, Obama. You didn't shoot the monkeys. You didn't get suckered into that one. And I think it's a very cogent rule. Now, you in your own experience are with a group of fascinating people. You're interacting with smart folks all over the world. And I guarantee that if you have your version of 3x5 cards and you're listening into these conversations, you will come up with not my rules of thumb, but your own rules of thumb. And that's really the point of this exercise. That's my last question first. The real point of this book is to engage in a conversation about your rules of thumb, what works for you that you think other people could learn from. If you go to the book's website, rulesofthumbook.com, there's a place to put up your rule number 53. And I'm inviting people to add their rule of thumb. I tend to comment on your rule of thumb, if you don't mind, and give you a little feedback about it, and I hope you give me feedback on mine. But my real passion behind this book is to create a discussion about what works, what's practical, and how to create change so that we do it right going forward. So that's the story behind the book. That's the story behind the 3x5 cards. And thanks for having me out here. Now, I promised it was going to be a dialogue. I talked way too long, as I also promised I would do. If anybody has a question or a comment or a reaction, I do have prizes for good questions. So take your shot. Questions are free. Yes, sir.
Often I've realized that if I add some rules like this, just for me, there's always been a contradictory rule that will, some of the times. And I find, that some of the times is most often for me.
Yeah.
So what's your personal experience with rules like that?
That's a great question. The question, if everybody heard it, was, for every rule, there's an equal and opposite rule. Basically, we all have learned, look before you leap, but we also learned, he who hesitates is lost. How can these both be true? And I guess the answer is you're right, but you're wrong. I think the real test of these rules, or the real value for me, is not so much that they tell you what to do, per se, although in some cases they're prescriptive, but mostly they're suggestive. And it's really the exercise of learning to think into a problem and to analyze what is the underlying story here that is the value of the exercise. You may look at these rules and say, these don't relate to my world at all. That's fine for me. It's really not about being right, whatever right means. I think the real proposition that I'd put in front of you is, imagine that this is not an operating manual so much as an invitation to a discussion and a conversation. And in that sense, you could say, your rules either don't apply to my work life, in which case I say, fine, what does? You write them down and send them to me. Or you could say, it's interesting because what you say in this rule is contradicted by what you say later. And I would say that's right. One of my rules covers that. It says we're moving from an either-or world to a both-and world. That increasingly it's not a choice, it's rather a synthesis that we're looking for. And I find that's true in competitive terms. You know, people say, what's the future of newspapers? Isn't paper going to disappear? And the answer is no. We're going to have both paper and electronic and something we haven't even thought of. But you get boxed in when you start thinking about dialectics. And dialectics, I think, are a trap. I think creativity comes through hybridization. And hybridization suggests that synthesis is the model, not dialectical choice. So that's kind of the way my brain works, that either-or choices are false traps. And the real game is to use this kind of thinking to create your own synthesis. But you do win a rules of thumb starter kit. I know you're not impressed now, but when you show this to your friends, they're going to be blown away. Yes?
So what are cultural aspects of the rules?
Great question. What are cultural elements that make the rules either bound by place or by sensibility? Well, I plead guilty to being an American of a certain age and of a certain gender and of a certain time. That said, I'm trying to learn. I think, again, the rules are designed to give you tools, not answers. So I'll give you a classic example that I just learned about how I don't even practice what I preach. One of the rules says content isn't king, context is king, which I learned from the early days of the dot-com era where everybody was saying, content's king, and I said, no, I'm in the magazine business. I'm not really selling content, I'm selling context, the ability to make sense out of events. So about 2 weeks ago, I find myself in Budapest speaking to a group of Eastern European bankers, mostly men, mostly younger than me, very serious, very committed to their bank's future. And as you can imagine, banking in Eastern Europe right now is not going well. Compared to what we're seeing, their unemployment in places like Hungary is 30%, and that's not counting what's going on in the second economy, the black market. But I'm an American. I'm impervious to this. I'm selling books, 2 at a time, right? So I get up in front of these bankers and I say, look, change is the order of the day. We have to embrace change. We have to adapt to change. We have to accept it. We have to be enthusiastic about it. Innovation, creativity, that's what leadership looks like in 2009. And they look at me and they say, you realize that in Eastern Europe, change comes in 2 flavors, fascism and communism. We've had the fascists in the past, and they wore brown shirts and they rounded people up. And more recently, we've had the communists, and they take away all our stuff. So I know you're enthusiastic about change, but we really like the status quo. So that to me was what my friend Tom Peters used to call an aha moment, where I said, okay, content isn't king, context is king, and your context in Eastern Europe, the word change means something very different to what it means to me as an American growing up in the 50s and 60s and seeing how change led to opportunity, freedom, diversity. Good point. I will not forget this next time. So the rules are very much born out of my experience. The way the book is structured, each rule starts with who I learned it from. There's a story that comes with it. How I learned it, who I learned it from. And then it goes into how you might apply it yourself. But I do think that there is a three-dimensionality to this experience, and as I go out and meet people and talk about how I would like to see these rules applied, they inform me about how the real world really works. And context is king. Thank you. We have another winner. Thank you. Yes?
You were talking about the concept of information overload and finding teachers. And just thinking about the technologies that a lot of people are using, like Twitter and blogging, and the fact that people, that readers or followers are kind of considered authority currency in that space. What's a practical way that you can identify your teachers? Because you generally have to follow people for a while before you realize they're a teacher, or people are telling you they're teachers and you don't know if you buy into it yet. So how do you balance that without getting the information overload?
Wow.
And what do you think of Twitter?
What do I think of Twitter? I think Twitter is a great invention. It's a way of taking 3x5 cards and making it electronic. And that's how I use it. I mean, I don't really write about whether I had a cup of coffee this morning. I try to reserve it for things like my factoid of the day, or something that somebody said to me that really resonated that I feel good about passing on, or when I'm reading a book. I'm reading right now a fabulous book which I highly recommend called Trickster Makes This World by Lewis Hyde. And when somebody recommends me a book, I either write it down on a 3x5 card, or I put it on my little Twitter deal and say, great book, go read it. And that's how I use it. You asked a much more difficult question, though, which is this issue of, if teachers are everywhere and we have to be alert all the time, how do we not fall over from information overload? And how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? I guess my cop-out answer to that question is I believe every one of us has what I used to do for a living, and that is we have an editorial function in our head. And we're simultaneously open systems and closed systems, basically. The challenge is not, for me at least, is not to be too much of a closed system. Witness my experience with the Eastern European bankers, where what I didn't know was I was coming to them from a bubble. I mistook my world for reality. And in that sense, I was a closed system. They opened that system for me in a heartbeat, and that was a moment of learning. You can't do it all the time, but the goal of being a great editor, at least as I tried, I'm not saying I was a great editor, the goal of being a great editor is to be a good listener. But not an undifferentiated listener, because not all information is created equal. And so what I would look for as an editor, I'd come to Microsoft looking for a story. And somebody would sit down with me and they'd say, here are the really 10 cool things we're working on here, none of which were interesting to me as an editor. Because everybody's doing good projects. That's not a learning moment. But then they would let something slip. They'd say, the really amazing thing somebody said to me the other day was fill in the blank. This happened all the time. I don't know how many of you ever read Tom Peters' Fast Company article, The Brand Called You. The way that article came about was I went to visit Tom in Vermont on his farm, and he was telling me about all the work he was doing and blah, 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 blah. And then he finally said, what really is amazing to me is how everybody's a brand. And I took out a 3x5 card and said, everybody's a brand. And that gelling of an idea, it's kind of like intellectual chiropractic, where all of a sudden you get there's a lineup there that just clicks into place. And you know it, all I can say is you know it when you hear it. And the more you practice, the more you hear it. And so you know how to screen out the noise, and you know how to let in the signal. Now the danger for me is that I let in I meet a lot of interesting people, and so I start to protect myself. And I build a kind of exoskeleton, and that's what those bankers were penetrating. I do think that it's active listening, it's active editing, And then it's finding a way to take notes, whether you do it electronically or the old-fashioned way. And it may be that at the end of the day, you're taking your notes and you're going, really wasn't that good. That's okay. That's fine. You know, these things are cheap. And you can throw them away. But the practice of doing it is really the practice of creating in your own head the lenses through which you create meaning in your own world. And that's what you're responsible for. You're not responsible for making truth. You're responsible for making meaning in your own world. Does that help at all? Not much. A little bit? All right. I tell you what, since it was a bad answer, I'll give you a T-shirt instead of a 3x5 card. You're not allowed to ask questions. Have we ever met before? You're poaching.
Well, since I've already read the book, but it kind of goes without question that you do talk in one chapter about exposing yourself kind of randomly to things you wouldn't normally come across. And I think one thing with Twitter and blogging, we tend to follow the people we are already interested in, our spheres of interest and experience. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that I have various, as a magazine guy, I have rants that I go off on. And one of them is how America is basically, in journalistic terms, a giant echo chamber. It's amazing, if you do the math, we have more news sources than ever and fewer stories than ever. And that's a fact, because everybody re-reports what everybody else is already reporting. So if you look at the web, it's a giant linking mechanism to the same X number of stories. There's very little of what I described in this chapter, and that is willful exposure to things outside your comfort zone. Most people, if they're conservative and they watch television news, they watch Fox because they already agree with what Fox is going to tell them. And it's very comfortable to be told how right you are. And if you're a little bit more liberal, you watch MSNBC and you learn that you're so smart because the pundits tell you what you already think. But there's very little getting outside the comfort zone. And I honestly think that is part of the learning experience for people who want to keep growing. And I used to do this all the time when I was trying to bring new ideas into Fast Company. I'd go down to the newsstand and I would randomly, almost, pick out magazines to take home and look at. I am not a science reader. So I'd pick up a science magazine and force myself to look at it. I love sports, so I would go buy an interior decorating magazine and see what I could learn about how they were presenting their stories, what the photographs looked like, what the headlines were like. I had to get myself out of my comfort zone so that I wasn't just constantly agreeing with myself. And I think that is it's something that all of us in our own work lives are prey to. It's something that, interestingly enough, the United States is probably, as a country, more given to than other parts of the world because we're so big. We don't have to speak other languages, and we don't really have to go other places. There's still a huge number of Americans who don't have a passport and would never think of leaving the country. And so the context we live in is one that is very cloistered. And it is actually a form of growth prevention. And it's hard, obviously, to expose yourself constantly to new stuff because you get bombarded. And nobody's got the constitution to take that. But you can I think you can turn it on and off. You know, these pieces of technology come with off buttons. And there is a way to get rid of them and shut down for a while. And that's also healthy. I split my time now between traveling and my home in Santa Fe. And they are totally different. Santa Fe is a town of about 50,000 people filled with artists and Native Americans, and it's a very quiet place. And when I'm on the road, I get bombarded with stimulation. And when I go back home, I give myself time to try to let it sink in and try to make sense out of it. And I find that it's almost like my life is a semi-permeable membrane, and the information is moving back and forth across it, either being absorbed or synthesized in some time. But that's hard to do. Yes, sir?
So if I spend some time creating my own rules of thumb,
Yeah.
then I start executing this plan, and then instantly people will start opposing you because you are not within their comfort zone and you're doing something totally different. So how do you cope with this, and what's the plan?
Well, I'm not sure I absolutely agree with your premise that if you have your own rules of thumb, you will automatically create hostility on the part of other people. If your rules of thumb are created by listening and learning from other people. And the goal of the exercise is not to be narcissistic, although we live in a very narcissistic society. The goal that I practice, and I try in this book to give credit to everybody from whom I learned, the goal is to take your experiences that you gather from the folks you work with or live with or have studied with, and to cycle them through your own sense-making mechanism. But it's not to say I'm smarter than you and I have the right answer to life's challenges. It's to create a methodology for learning and playing with other people in productive ways. So I don't see it as a them versus me competition for who's got the best rules.
Very few people have rules.
No, everybody has rules. We just don't make them.
Execute them.
Everybody has rules and everybody executes them all the time. They're very rarely at the level of conscious observation. What we don't see, you've got so many. You have so many rules. You can't function without rules. You have rules about how you drink your coffee. If you drink coffee, if you don't drink coffee, that's a rule about not drinking coffee. Everybody has rules.
We're talking about significant rules, like what makes you wake up in the morning. It's not the rule that I drink my coffee with sugar or cream. It's what really makes you wake up in the morning.
Well, I
So
chose rules. I intentionally chose rules that I thought were salient to larger questions of life. But the point still, I think, holds that you cannot function without a set of rules. You may think that a rule about how you drink your coffee is trivial, but in some cultures it's very important. And in some religious groups, it's not allowed. So it is a salient point that rules are how we make up our lives. What's not happening frequently, and I'm not taking your point lightly, what is, I think, more what I'm driving at is the exercise of making your rules, first of all, a way of interpreting experience, and secondly, something you share with other people. And it's not sharing them with other people in the service of getting them to do stuff your way, per se. It's creating a shared understanding. So I may be missing your point, for which I apologize, but I think that what at least my goal is to try to create a platform on which many people can stand to talk about how they would do it. So let me give you an example. Here's a rule. Take your work seriously, yourself not so much. And I learned this from the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is a man, or a god, depending on your point of view, who, when he's in his capital, meets every day with the people who are fleeing their home country and escaping to freedom. And they've had tortured escapes. And this is a man who, when I encountered him, I asked him, what do you think is, what's your take on what China is doing to your native country? And he says, the problem isn't that there are so many Chinese going to Tibet. The problem is they're sending stupid Chinese to Tibet. They should send smarter Chinese to Tibet. They don't send Chinese who know how to cook well. He's having a great time with this question. And I thought to myself, this is a man who lives on the edge of pain, and he's able to laugh. He takes his work seriously, but himself not so much. Now, I don't think that's a rule that would divide you and me. I think that's a rule where we could have an interesting conversation about when it's okay to take yourself seriously, when it is over the top, when it's narcissism, when it's legitimate leadership behavior. I don't mind that conversation at all. The rule isn't a dictum that I think you're a bad human being if you don't follow it. It's a way of thinking about making sense out of life. One more question. Who wants it the most?
I think I do.
All right.
That's a rule. I'm kidding. No,
If you want it, you get it.
no, I'm kidding.
No, go ahead. What's your
All right,
question?
well, I'll share the T-shirt with the other two guys. It's a quick rule. It's a quick question, so maybe we can...
I'll try to answer short instead of long.
Why 52 rules? Is it the idea that we have one rule per week? Or
That's a great question. The answer is there were originally 99 rules, and my publisher said, nobody's going to read a book with 99 rules, you idiot. And she proposed 52, and I said, that's a good number. It's weeks, it's cards. Let's go with it.
That worked. Okay, another.
Next question.
Yeah.
Just a quick marketing thing. I'll make the decision if I buy your book or not.
No pressure.
Do you have information in the book about how to apply the same thinking to a group?
What's the same thinking?
How a group can work out together a set of rules for it to operate by as a social system as opposed to the individuals. I get the whole individual thing. I got a whole psychology background and stuff. But I work on a nonprofit, and we have a very bizarre set of what I can now term in the same way rules that you have.
Sure.
I would like to see how much I could glean out of your thinking and apply in a social organizations.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. There is, when I ran the Harvard Business Review, we used to send out cards to people saying, what kind of an article would you like to see in the Harvard Business Review? And I remember vividly, I got a card back from somebody saying, I would like to see an article in the Harvard Business Review about how to run a small hotel, signed Joe Jones, owner of a small hotel. And I thought, this may be too small of a market segment. There is not a rule of thumb that says, here's how to run nonprofits or how to run groups. Although everything in this book is about human behavior and about how people work with other people. I can't point at a rule and say this is the one that applies to social enterprise.
Actually, that's not really the question is taking the philosophy of rules
Yeah.
and applying that. So if you look at this as your own, as a system for someone to think about how to build and have the discussion with themselves and others around them about the rules for their life, can you,
Yes.
how well can that translate
I
to
think-
a group of people working together and say, how can we build a set of rules
I
for
think
our
it's
group?
everything in this book comes from my work experiences, being part of a political campaign at an office in the mayor's office in Portland, Oregon, organizing, hiring, and running the Harvard Business Review, and trying to get a group of people to play nicely together, creating Fast Company as an enterprise of a startup of new people trying to create a culture together. I never played anything but team sports growing up. I don't know how to hit a tennis ball or ski, but I played, football, basketball, and baseball because those are team sports. And I think the underlying theory of the book is we all have to work together in order to get anything done. All right. One more.
Okay, so communication.
Yes, sir.
You were talking about coming up with the new paradigm, the new, for lack of a better term, buzz phrase like everybody's a brand, for instance, and how that really...
Yeah.
So there's a big problem with people who are journalists who are trying to share a truth that nobody is ready to see yet, or futurists who are describing a future that they can see very clearly from their context, but others are not ready for. So do you believe that this coming up with the exact right paradigm thingy is the bridge to actually communicating to regular people?
I think what happens,
what the future
I think it's communicating to people what the present is. When I was at Fast Company, and even with this book, what I've found is there are people who come up to me and say, I don't know how you knew what I was thinking, but I couldn't find the words for it, and you put it the way that makes sense to me. There's a rule in here that says, learn to take no as a question. And I've had a lot of people who came up to me and said, God, I've been looking for that formulation for my whole entrepreneurial work life. Or I had a woman who runs the community foundation in Santa Fe who said, learn to take no as a question. That's what I've been trying to articulate as my philosophy of running this nonprofit. I think when you see, gets back to my notion of intellectual chiropractic. You know it when you hear it. It goes click. And that's what great novels do, movies do, fiction, whatever it happens to be. When it absolutely gets the configuration right, that tells you this is what I've been thinking, but I didn't have the words for it. That's when you write it down on your 3x5 card. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.